Hello. Hi, everybody. How we doing? Okay, let me get all this set up here. A little bit bright. What are you going to do? Kind of don't really care about that. Let me get all this sorted out. Put some of this over here, some of that. All right, how's everybody doing? It's a beautiful day here in England for once. It's very nice. It's been like fucking like 75 degrees here every day. It's been wild for like the past 2 weeks. It's been very, very nice. Um, and I figured what better to do on a lovely day like today than sit inside and talk to you all about some of this stuff. Social engagement of social science, the socio-technical systems perspective. So, what we're going to be doing today, for people who listened to our last episode, it was an interview with a listener named Roger, really, really smart dude. And we had Donal on to basically come on and discuss all sorts of things. Sorry, let me just move this up here. I'm just noticing things that I just have not fixed or gotten ready. And what we did was we basically talked with them all about kind of concrete organizing. Roger got in touch with us and was like, hey, there are some like legitimate concerns to be had about the Bible system model as a model for organizing. I'd like to kind of, I think you guys should maybe talk about that a bit, as well as look into some ulterior models of organizing. I'm not super sold on kind of criticisms of the Bible system model as such. I do understand what Roger was saying about like fallacy of like appeal to nature, and it's like, well, this is how like a human body operates, so this should be how a social system operates. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense necessarily, but I do think that the Bible system model is a really good guideline, and I think that Stafford Beer kind of understood its limits. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not an expert on all this stuff. But what I do think is really necessary, and that Roger's got us like all kind of thinking about, is actual new methods of concrete organizing that you can have in your workplace. And what do I mean by that? Like, let's say whatever your kind of crummy job is. Up until recently, I was working in retail at like a farming supply store or whatever, right, in the warehouse. And one of the main reasons that it sucked, other than it just being like a shitty minimum wage job, was that management would like always come into the warehouse, tell us what to do, hassle us, get us to do all of this unnecessary shit, organize things in a really bad way, spy on us with the security cameras, call up the warehouse and be like, "Wah, quit sitting down on the pig feed," or whatever, you know what I mean? And it was basically like fundamentally mismanaged by an entity that, shall we say, didn't really know what it was doing, because it didn't have the necessary variety to like manage all aspects of the shop as it's expected to do. So it had to do so in a really disciplinary and kind of crummy way in terms of productivity, right? Like it wasn't able to get all of what it needed to do done. So imagine the revolution comes along and we get communism just like that, and you go into work and everything's still kind of the exact same. You know what I mean? Like, I look very short. Hang on. I promise. I promise I'm 5'4". I'm really tall. And let's say the revolution comes, you go into work, and it's the exact same fucking thing, and you go home and you're like, wait a minute, we have communism now. Why does everything still suck? That probably is because the workplace, like, wasn't necessarily reorganized in a way that made you kind of less alienated from your job. And that could be because there are still communist managers, communist bureaucrats that like fucking hassle you, all sorts of stuff that you wouldn't want to have happen, still happening. And so what we're going to do today is look at some different ideas around organizing different workplaces that you could actually do. Because again, like we said this on the show, like you could have the revolution and still have everything kind of fucking suck. You know what I mean? So we're going to try and figure out how you can kind of de-alienate things and, make things a bit better. Just a couple of minutes behind. But hi, what up, Tom? How you doing? I hope you're doing all right, man. We're going to be looking at some workplace organizational stuff. Because in that interview that we did with Roger, we didn't necessarily get to talk about these essays that he sent us. They're really fucking good, and they're like actually ways. Again, you can do all the Marxism you want, you can have a Marxist government or whatever, but if you don't actually reorganize your workplace, which I don't think necessarily comes along with like the abstract level stuff that you're talking about with Marxism, things might still kind of fucking suck. So we're gonna look at some of these. To start us out, we're actually gonna be looking at this essay, which is the Volvo Plant. This is like in the 90s, there were these two Volvo manufacturing plants, one in Kalmar in Sweden and one in Uddevalla, that like attempted to completely reorganize things and had some pretty stunning results. We're going to get to that, but actually the first thing that we're going to do, we're going to look at the second thing we're going to read first. You'll see what I mean here in a second, which is The Social Engagement of Social Systems, the Socio-Technical Systems Perspective by somebody named Eric Trist. I'm not sure who that is. I'm sure he's a very nice fella. But we're going to skip all the way down here just so I can kind of explain what we're talking about. And we're going to look at what Eric Trist calls kind of the 4 types of industrial democracy, right? So I'm just going to read this. He says, confusion regarding the forms and meaning of industrial democracy has persisted. 4 different forms may be distinguished, right? So this is him saying that there are 4 different types of workplace organizing that we can point to and criticize and try and, figure out what's wrong with them so we can move past them, right? All of which represent modes of participation and the sharing of power. We like that. They are, first of all, interest group democracy. So basically what this is kind of like just like unions, right? So he says, i.e. collective bargaining through which organized labor gains power to take an independent role vis-a-vis management, right? So unions, interest group democracy. I got interest rates on the brain. Representative democracy, whereby those at the lower levels of an organization influence policies decided at a higher level. This is kind of like workers' councils, workers just on boards, which are two like very different things, but you can kind of see what he's saying here. Representative democracy, it's like, I elect this schmuck that I work with to go and work, or to go and like make decisions at a higher level. And if they suck at what they do, then we recall them and we got somebody else to go up there, right? That's representative democracy. Probably the one up until reading this that I was like, oh yeah, it's just how you do it, right? You just elect people to go on boards, councils, or whatever, and bada bing, bada boom. Maybe I'm too council brained, but we'll get to the criticisms of those here in a second. So owner democracy, this is as in employee-owned firms and cooperative establishments where there is participation and equity. So this is just co-ops. That job I was just talking about that I had up until recently working at the kind of shitty like retail garden supply farming supply center in the warehouse, that was a co-op. And let me tell you, it was very similar to working at a non-co-op. But also, to be fair, I was on a 0-hour contract, so what are you going to do? And then finally, okay, so those are the first three things that he says. These are kind of things that we've all tried in the past. Unions, basically councils, and co-ops. And he's like, they all suck. What we need is this special fourth thing, right? And he calls that work-linked democracy. And this is the thing we're going to be talking all about today. This stuff is so fucking fascinating. Whereby the participation is secured of those directly involved in decisions about how work shall be done at their own level. This is kind of what you need to do, right? We'll get into kind of like why this might not solve alienation in its entirety, why you need to like obviously pair this with something like Marxism, not only to get it done, but also to understand what alienation actually is. But this is actually, as close as I've found, something that really makes a conscious effort to get past alienation on the shop floor, not just in terms of like, oh, we elected somebody to the local, schmuck council, and now I'm not alienated anymore. It's like, well, if you're still working in the same hierarchical ways, like you are still alienated. So he goes on to say these four forms may be found independently or together, in consonance or contradiction, and at different degrees in various contemporary industrial societies. But the work-linked form has been the last to appear historically, and is that with which the socio-technical restructuring of work is associated. It is the only approach which positively changes the immediate quality of the work experience, which is what we want to do. We don't just want to like change, the like labor government for like a red government. We don't want to just change the Democrats for like the communist government. We want to actually change what it means to go into work every day and your experience of working, right? Because probably still going to need to work. You know what I mean? I'm not one of these people that's just like, well, once we get full automation, nobody will have to work. That's never, ever going to happen in a million years for a million different reasons. So we're still going to have to go into work. So how can we make it better? The other approaches, which still have their own merits, do not affect the basic problem of worker alienation. Increasing congruency may be hypothesized among the four factors in the long run. Organizational democracy would be a preferable term to industrial democracy. I think that's fair. So I think as we read these two essays, we're going to kind of see that these people are like almost certainly just social democrats. I don't actually know too much about Eric Trest or whoever wrote this other one. The other one, the Volvo one, is kind of just like a research paper. It's not necessarily politically charged. But, we'll see. There's a little bit of like, well, maybe we should just work with the capitalists to like make worker alienation disappear, which is a little bit like, okay, yeah, let me know how that goes. But, so yeah, that's this one. We'll come back to it here in a second. But now, to really understand a concrete example of how this stuff was kind of put into place actually pretty well in like a capitalist environment, we're going to look at this essay. Volvo Uddevalla, hopefully that's how you say it. That's just the place where one of these factories was. A dead horse or a car dealer's dream. Listen, if there's one thing you know about communists, it's that we're always trying to please the car dealers. I don't know if any of you have seen, somebody recently wrote an article for some magazine or something that I was reading all about like how important used car dealers and like car dealer franchises, like Ford franchise or some bullshit, are to the owners of those businesses, are to the Republican base in America, and just like how fucking reactionary they are. So again, not necessarily trying to please the car dealers here, but this is an evaluation of the economic performance of Volvo's unique assembly plant, which only lasted 3 years, and we'll see why it only lasted 3 years, despite being better in like literally every way possible or at least according to this one essay. It's by a fellow named Christian Berggren. And let's have a look. So this was kind of like in the immediate aftermath. Look, it looks like it was written as well. I only just noticed that now. So I got my fucking notes here. Let's have a look. Okay, so let's have a look at this first paragraph here. So, again, well, fuck it. I'll just start reading it because this gives us enough background. Hopefully that's big enough. Can I make it a little bit bigger? Would that do anything? Or is that going to fuck everything up? No, that's fine. You have created something very special. 4 years ago in 1989, Volvo inaugurated a radically new assembly plant in Uddevalla on the Swedish west coast. Boasted the plant manager, this isn't just new production technology, it is the death of the assembly line. You like the sound of that? You like the death of the assembly line. The plant design was conspicuously different from standard car plants, and this is like the key stuff here, okay? So beginning here. This is what makes this different from just like a Taylorist fucking assembly line, right? Which if anyone's ever worked on those, I've never worked in a factory or anything like that, but we've all done menial labor for 8 hours a day at least, right? In one capacity for another. The same thing over and over again. It kills you. It literally fucking kills you. It does not make you want to keep living. It is really bad. So, again, we don't just want communist assembly lines built in the Taylorist fashion, right? So, at regular production, what am I looking at here? So, this is the key stuff. Instead of one long line, a multitude of small parallel teams built complete cars. At regular production pace, individual cycle times ranged from 1.5 to 7 hours, a stark contrast to the 1-minute standards on the assembly lines. So, okay, that's kind of weird. Like, there was like this big variation in terms of how long it would take a car to be built. That doesn't seem good. The teams were supported by a partially automated materials handling process that for each car delivered an individual kit of parts and components to the assembly shops. Vocational training and technical information had been redesigned to sustain a new assembly culture characterized by fundamental understanding and combined product and process knowledge. Okay. This is very important. New technical aids made for assembly work, or I can't say this word, ergonomically vastly superior to traditional forms. This included an ambitious project to develop new hand tools adaptable to different sizes and different grips, as well as tilted assembly, enabling assemblers to work, blah, 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 blah. That last bit is basically like, they made work better for these people by investing in like their tools, which like, whoa, wow, what a crazy idea. But this is the important stuff. I'll read it again. Vocational training and technical information had been redesigned to sustain a new assembly culture characterized by functional understanding and combined product and process knowledge. Okay, so we'll get into a bit more about the specifics of how this actually worked here in a second, but what they're saying is that instead of like, you know, the one jerk who does the, I don't really know how car production works, the jerk who attaches the stickers that say the object in your mirror will be bigger than it appears or whatever on the rear view mirrors, and that's all they do all day. Instead of having that and like, you know, a redundancy of people who perform, you know, individual sets of tasks, what they have are small teams where everybody knows how to do everything. And then they just give them like a car frame, go, here's what the customer wants, just make it happen, right? And surprisingly, this actually wound up not just making people's lives better, because they were like, hey, now I'm not just the jerk that puts stickers on windows, I'm like actually someone that knows how to functionally make a car, but it also actually upped productivity. And by investing in their workers in these kind of, like, as they say in the latter parts of this paragraph here, where they invest in new technical aids that are like fitted to each worker, giving them like, you know, this is very Swedish, giving them like little chairs where they're able to like, you know, move around and kind of like tilt their chair and work upside down as opposed to like, you know, having to get down and bend over and do all of this crappy stuff. Productivity actually went up, and it also gave them a level of autonomy, right? Where it's like, okay, you know, Bob's sick or something like that. So Mary comes in and there's no backlog because now the one person who knows how to do the one task isn't there. So now a million cars are going to pile up. Everybody knows how to do everything. So when you invest in vocational training and work in these little teams where everybody knows how to do everything, it actually works a lot better, kind of counterintuitively, to a traditional assembly line, which is really, really cool. Okay, so let's move on here. So if we scroll down, we'll see this is kind of a list that the author has of all of the different ways in which working in these small teams, as opposed to an assembly line, was actually better. There was a 50% improvement in productivity, right? Quality, there was a clear edge, basically because customers, and we'll get into how the customer relationship also changed to the factory, But customers are basically able to be like, well, I kind of want this thing to be very specific to this thing. And instead of it kind of fucking up the entire process and backlogging everything because it's like one car per assembly line, right? And if there's one thing that a customer wants that's going to take longer, it kind of backs everything up. As opposed to that, well, everybody knows how to do everything. You just give it to this one little team, and it doesn't actually really back things up. Cost-effective technical solutions, again, once people understood the equipment that they were using and they invested in it, it made things a lot better and a lot cheaper, which I kind of don't really give a fuck about, but what are you going to do? Savings in social costs due to minimum health and safety hazards. That just kind of, I suppose, speaks for itself. Higher flexibility, 50% lower tool and training costs at each annual model change. So this is actually really interesting. Again, this kind of comes from investing in the technology of their tools, but in making these tools, well, actually, let me just read this because he does a good job of explaining it. At Uddevalla, flexible production design and highly skilled teams rendered the yearly model conversions much easier than at the line assembly plants. For the 3 years between 1990 and 1992, this resulted in very substantial cost savings in both tools and training. The time required to return to normal productivity after an annual model change was half the time needed on the lines at the Gothenburg plant. Now, this is something that's actually really important in, I guess, just producing anything, but in terms of cars as well. Like, cars is a really good example of this because every year there's a new model of the exact same car, or there's a new year of the exact same model, right? Where you kind of have to adapt to changes in the market and different stuff like this. And if you have a assembly line that's just basically geared towards producing one thing, and then at the end of the year you keep having to change it, you have to kind of change the entire assembly line, as opposed to kind of just like looking into these individual teams and just like tweaking small things and giving them better training kind of all at once in these teams. There's like a much lower training cost and a much like kind of, there's less in terms of time that you need to invest in kind of changing your whole like productive apparatus, right? And then they also combine customer order assembly and short delivery times. We'll get into actually that, kind of what that means here in a second. So let me see here. Okay. So, scroll down here, 1.3, where is that? Yeah, here. I've got the big auxiliary statements fucking binder of all of our goddamn bullshit in here. I just call my goddamn notes. So, when we kind of talk about how big changes to productive apparatuses and worker well-being happen under capitalism, we have to kind of understand that changes like this don't really just happen kind of just out of the blue, right? They tend to happen, as we saw in Andreas Malm's Fossil Capital. Capitalists really only invest in productivity when they have to, and what that generally means is when they're trying to discipline labor, right? Like, through upping productivity, you're able to kind of, in theory, have less workers, which means you're able to fire like a large amount of workers if they're kind of getting a bit uppity, right? And you're just able to make more money, which they like, but they will only kind of do that if they're pushed. And so generally, like we saw with the switch from steam power in the textile industry in Britain in the early 19th century, the shift from the shift from water-powered mills to steam-powered mills, which kind of let off this huge industrial boom that was just like a complete boon to capitalism, and set off the fucking fossil fuel economy. This really only happened because of massive labor unrest. And surprise, surprise, I don't know if the author really necessarily understands what's going on or why this happened, but the exact same thing was going on in Sweden in the early 90s and the late 80s, right? So he says that Uddevalla was planned in a time of industrial labor crises in Sweden when Volvo was plagued by widespread employee dissatisfaction. As late as in 1990, personnel turnover in the assembly plant in Gothenburg, which was not built along these lines, this was like a traditional massive assembly line thing, exceeded 35%, which is pretty fucking brutal. Total annual cost for the deficiencies in the worker environment and the ergonomics of this plant was estimated to be 670 MSEK, which I would imagine is million. What is it the Swedish kroner? Is that what they use? I don't know. Whatever. It's $100 million. A basic mission at Uddevalla was to bring about a renewal of manufacturing work. In this, the plant was extremely successful. While car assembly is still hard work, the broad and varied job content and superior ergonomics at Uddevalla imply very low risks of repetitive strain injuries and cumulative trauma disorders. So again, how is communism going to actually fundamentally change the way that you work when you go into work, you know, the day after the revolution? We have to be thinking about these things, right? Like, we might laugh at like, oh, it's so Swedish to like change the ergonomics of their wrenches or something like that to like better fit, I don't know, different workers, or to be better adapted if you need to change it because like a certain bolt size changed in the new model of car, and so you're just easily able to like replace its parts, right? Things like that. Things like that actually really fundamentally change the way that you work and change the way that you think about work. I'm not going to sit here and say that all of this stuff changes, you know, alienation completely, but it certainly fucking helps, and it would be a big step in the right direction, and also would be more productive, which for all of you sicko, fully automated luxury communism people out there, that's what you're all about. Also Grossmanites, I guess. Councilists, what are you going to do? So let's get back into the parallel team structure. The author says that one of the advantages of the parallel team system was that support staff could concentrate solely on helping those teams that were in need the most. So if you kind of train support staff to be able to, again, do every task that needs to happen, as opposed to just like maybe be able to fill in a mediocre way in some of the different assembly line plants if somebody calls in sick or if somebody gets hurt or something like that, having like a support staff that's able to do everything is again just as useful as having these main teams do things. So on the line at the Gothenburg plant, there's normally 1 day's gap between the old and new annual models. During that time, industrial engineers and subforemen relocate materials, adjust equipment, and provide new tools. Assembly workers are informed about the changes, but seldom participate very accurately. Again, that's another type of alienation. Again, alienation, obviously, like in its Marxist definition, is, you know, the fundamental separation between you at your job and the means of production, or as some of the councilists would say, right, like the right of disposal, you know what I'm saying? Which actually kind of these days I do feel like is maybe like a bit better of a phrase. But it's also this: being alienated from your work is having absolutely no connection to changes that happen at your workplace, you know? And while I'm not like a complete anarchist, and I'm not going to sit around here and just say like everybody needs to have the exact same say in everything, because you do need to have somebody kind of looking to the external environment, looking to different perturbations that can happen, and have a kind of meta system like a certain management team. But to use kind of a weird metaphor, I was listening to somebody, who was it? It was somebody on Derek Varn's show. It wasn't the guy that has, oh fuck, I'm not gonna remember. It's not the like anarchist anthropologist guy, Arnold Schroeder. It's not him, but it's the guy that he kind of works with. Fuck, I forget his name. I feel really bad. But anyway, he made a really good point about like, well, how can you get a meta system, a managerial staff, to not be alienating to the workforce? And he kind of used a bit of a weird example, but one that I think is actually very salient, where he was like, think about it about like BDSM or something like that, right? In like a sexual relationship. Like, obviously BDSM without approval, what's the word? Consent, is just abuse, right? And we don't want that. That's abuse. But with consent, it's BDSM. And if you're into that, you're into that. Fine. You know, good for you. That sounds great. Good for you. It's the same thing with management, right? Like, as long as there is some kind of democratic process here, as long as there is a kind of fundamental de-opaquing, transparentizing of the tasks that management undertakes and why they're doing it, it's not going to be so bad if you have to have a like quote unquote manager or something like that, right? So as long as everybody's okay with it, as long as these people are recallable, it's fine. But he says here, by contrast, the assembly teams at Uddevalla themselves implemented the changes. So again, maybe you could just do it like that. They studied the new instructions and rearranged their own workplaces. The system of materials provision, the kits, were by themselves an important means to help assemblers learn the new annual model. And again, it's funny because this is in capitalist best interest, right? To not have to hire like a million fucking managers like they do at every job these days. We talked with Roger a little bit about this. At my job now, I just have like a crummy administrative job. And it's funny because like for every administrator, there is like 5 fucking managers. It's so insane. It's like, this is the shit that almost turns me into an anarchist, because it's just like, it's so clearly just a system of domination, because they're just wasting all of this fucking money. And we're going through a massive restructuring right now, right? Where my workplace is like, we just don't have any money. Where could this money be going? And it's just like, oh my fucking God. And they start laying off people like on my grade, right? And it's just like, a fucking piece of shit. I wonder where all that money's going. But again, that's just to basically say, like, cutting down on managerial roles is in the capitalist's best interests, and it's also just in like the workers' best interest, which I really find fascinating. Although at the end of this essay, we'll see maybe it wasn't in the capitalist's best interest. Maybe things were too good. So he goes into here talking a little bit about tech, but I might actually skip this. And then he goes into talking a little bit about here about the ways in which communication between the factory and the actual people consuming the products made at the factory changed. So maybe not necessarily the people consuming the goods. It was actually the car dealers. God bless car dealers. They're all such good progressive people. But basically what happened was they just completely cut out a middleman sales team in Volvo, and they just made it so that Uddevalla, this plant in Uddevalla, directly communicated with the car dealers. And one thing that facilitated was, say a customer was like, oh, I really like this new Volvo, but I'd really like it with no GPS for whatever reason. They don't want a GPS. You know, I've never like bought a car at a car dealer, so I don't actually know how this stuff works, but presumably there are things that you can do to customize your car, right? And so what this allowed the car dealers to do was basically take those instructions, take those orders, give them to Uddevalla directly, and Uddevalla would go, okay, this will take about X amount of time. Like, I don't know, like I don't know how long it takes to make a car. Let's just say a week. I have no idea. And they were able to basically establish this really quick communication line where, because of the adaptivity of these small individual teams working in the factory, they were able to get it done just like that. You don't have to update the entire assembly line. You don't have to train one person how to do one thing. The key here is that you have a redundancy of skills at your workplace. Everybody is working on the same level in small individual teams, and it ups productivity. It makes the process much faster. There are a million different fail-safes if something goes wrong, and you're able to adapt to customers' needs. This is kind of like is it variety attenuation or is it variety amplification? I guess it's variety amplification. Sorry, it's fucking hot in here, and I have to have the window shut because the car's really loud. And I live in a goddamn attic, so what are you going to do? I'm sweating like a pig. But it is variety amplification, right? Because you're basically saying your factory is absorbing the variety from the external environment, in this case, the schmuck, like people buying cars, right? And they're able to basically have this redundancy of skills and this adaptive way of working where they're able to just take that variety in stride and just keep going. I really think this is a really fascinating way of working. Again, the key is a redundancy of skills and people working in teams where everybody knows how to do everything and not necessarily this like sicko specialization that you get with Taylorism, right? And it's interesting. I'm interested to know some of you like applying this at your workplaces, how this would work, because at mine, well, I don't know. I have one of those so-called bullshit jobs, so I don't really know. But kind of the other people that I work with, I don't really want to give away where I work or what I do. But yeah, you could definitely apply it. If you start thinking about this, you'll start noticing like unnecessary specializations in the name of productivity around your workplace, and you'll go, oh, actually, yeah, you'll go to your boss and be like, actually, I've been reading about cybernetics recently, and they'll hand you a pink slip, and they'll go, you are really annoying, please stop working here. Okay, anything else about Uddevalla? I suppose we can talk about... Oh, okay, yeah, let's talk about why it fucking collapsed. So, this was so great. This plant was so great. It was so great for all of the workers. It was so great for all of the capitalists. Everybody was making more money. Why did it collapse? Well, it collapsed for a number of reasons. One, because Volvo is owned by Renault. Is it Renault? I don't know. We don't have those cars where I'm from, so I don't really know how to say it. Renault? That would be very funny. Terminally French. Speaking of French things, I'll get right back to this in a second. Somebody, oh my god, this made me laugh so hard. Dan and I did an episode not too long ago on a book about the French Revolution, and it was called Rethinking the French Revolution. And it was basically all about, like, was the French Revolution capitalist? Was it bourgeois? Was it neither? And somebody quote tweeted when I put that on Twitter, some French person, and in French, I had to translate it, they were like, this just goes to show that the Anglos know nothing about our history. I was just like, whoa, what does that mean? I was like, geez. They're like, the fucking Anglos know nothing about France. I was like, entirely possible, entirely possible. I'm just taking George Comnenal's word for it. Okay, so anyway, if these plants were so great, why did they collapse? Well, one of the reasons is because Renault didn't really like what they were seeing. They didn't necessarily take the time to look at the actual numbers, the reports, the financial reports that for kind of that quarter, I guess, or something like that. I don't fucking know how business cycles work. They didn't necessarily take the time to look at financial returns. All they saw was all of this money being invested into these new hippy-dippy SocDem plants, and they were just like, Sweden, you're too Swedish for your own good. we're shutting these plants down, and we're going to relocate everything to the Gothenburg plant, where everything is centralized and tailorized and done on an assembly line, because that's what we know. We know that we'll be able to work with that. But another reason, and a much more interesting reason, is what the author goes into here. And I'm going to quote him here. So he says, a third fateful player in this process was the Gothenburg plant itself. This works had taken a series of heavy cuts, and that's phrased weirdly, and neither management nor unions could accept taking any more. So another, like, in the background of all of this, there's a large labor crisis and kind of like a mini recession going on in Sweden, right? They both demanded the sacrifice of the Uddevalla plant to save volume and jobs at the main plant. Only a few years earlier, the Swedish Metalworkers Union had been heavily involved in the development of the Uddevalla concept. The plant was seen as a model of labor management cooperation and proof that the metalworkers' demand for a fundamental renewal of manufacturing was no wishful thinking. Blah, 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 blah. He keeps going on all about this, but this is the fundamental bit. Basically what had happened was that the Gothenburg plant, they were going to keep making more cuts at this plant, and the unions were just like, listen, we can't keep making more cuts here. Management also agreed, because productivity would like have slowed to a halt if they made any more cuts. And so there was this weird moment of like the unions and the management of this one specific plant kind of being like, actually, let's get rid of that more productive plant, this experiment. This is not the time to be doing it, and let's just move on. And Volvo has never opened another one of these since, to my knowledge. So thank you, unions, for that one. So that's the Volvo Uddevalla plant. I recommend people going and looking a little bit more at it, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the exact same stuff right now. Wow, look at that. So we're going to get into, as I said earlier, the Socio-Technical Systems Perspective by Eric Trist. Let me flip to that on my fucking booklet here. And so what this is kind of another case study, but instead of in car factories in Sweden, it is in coal plants and mines in Britain, in post-war Britain, specifically around 1949, where things weren't going so well. Things basically weren't going so well. He says here, the newly nationalized industry was not doing so well. Productivity failed to increase in step with increases in mechanization. Men, specifically, were leaving the mines in large numbers for more attractive opportunities in the factories. Among those who remained, absenteeism averaged 20%, because I would imagine working in a coal mine kind of fucking blows. Labor disputes were frequent despite improved conditions of employment. Sometime earlier, the National Coal Board, that sounds evil, had asked the Institute to make a comparative study of high-producing, high-morale mine and a low-producing, low-morale but otherwise equivalent mine. Despite nationalization, however, our research team was not welcome at the coal face under the auspices of that board. Oh no. So they found a couple things. They found that one of these plants where there was high morale and high productivity had organized itself in a completely different way. And it's along the same lines that Volvo basically worked. And it seems like this kind of speaks to a trend in understanding skill redundancy as opposed to staff redundancy on a Taylorist line, right? So if you imagine how like a Taylorist workplace would work in a coal factory, presumably there's someone who stays at the bottom of the mine. It's so sad to imagine. And just like all day pickaxes coal. Presumably there's another person whose job it is to just take that coal, put it in buckets, and put it on a trolley. It's another one's job to like take that trolley up to the coal face. It's another person's job to sort all the coal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so if you work at that coal mine, you're going to have a job where you just do one repetitive task all day. But at this one coal mine in Tavistock, I believe it is. Was it a coal mine or was it a coal... Oh no, I'm sorry. This was undertaken by the Tavistock Institute. So where was this fucking mine? Somewhere in Britain. And they had organized themselves in a similar way to Uddevalla. So some of the principles involved at this mine were as follows. The work system, which comprised a set of activities that made up a functioning whole, now became the basic unit rather than the single jobs into which it was decomposable. What does that mean? That seems like it means nothing. I think it actually means something quite important. As opposed to viewing everything as the individual tasks that workers do, they then basically made the entire system of the work that they were doing, i.e., I guess, taking coal from bottom of mine to top of mine onto trucks, off to wherever, right? That's the work system, and you need to fundamentally view that as one thing. Correspondingly, the work group became central rather than the individual job holder. Okay, interesting. Internal regulation of the system by the group was thus rendered possible rather than the external regulation of individuals by supervisor. We like the sound of that. We like internal regulation. It sounds like a big struggle session. My mind, Dan and I are reading something about it's Sorghum and Steele from Shuang's first journal, and it's a history of the Chinese Communist Party, so my mind is fully on struggle sessions. Funny side note, I know somebody who's doing a Gestalt psychotherapy training course, and they literally have struggle sessions. It sounds fucking horrifying. They'll literally be like, damn, you kind of sucked in today's training session. What's the deal with that? And everybody just, like, presumably points and laughs. I don't really know how these things operate, but I do think that's funny. It sounds horrifying. I'm doing a training course to become a counselor right now, not Gestalt, and whew, boy, let me tell you, I wouldn't be able to handle that. A design principle based on the redundancy of functions rather than on the redundancy of parts, again, redundancy of tasks, not redundancy of parts, characterized the underlying organizational philosophy, which tended to develop multiple skills in the individual and multiple skills in the individual, we like that, and immensely increase the response repertoire of the group. This principle valued the discretionary rather than the prescribed part of work roles. So I'm not saying that this is like solving alienation once and for all, because these workers clearly didn't have right of disposal. Fuck, if these workers got right of disposal and just, like, you know, did something not very nice to the person who was in charge of the country at around this time, or would be when the kind of things came to a head at the the disputes between the government and the coal mines, say no more, we'd have a very different world. Obviously, they did not have right of disposal, so alienation was not ended in the Marxist sense. But we need to be thinking about alienation in both of these terms, right? Like, developing multiple skills in a worker and making it so that you're not just, like, in my case, an asshole administrator who gets sent emails and, like, simple fucking Excel forms all day, and it's just like, can you do this? I don't want to do this. Or in terms of, like, somebody at a coal mine or somebody at a car plant, like, really understanding the entire work system that they're part of and being able to slot in anywhere, and not even just be able to slot in anywhere, doing everything with your work group who are on the same level as you. It's like the antithesis of the Taylorist production line, and it seems like it works much better, and it would definitely be de-alienating, if not with a capital A in the Marxist sense, right? It treated the individual as complementary to the machine as rather as an extension to it. I don't really understand what that means. That just kind of seems like it means nothing. It was variety increasing for both the individual and the organization rather than variety decreasing in the bureaucratic mode. So again, this goes into what we were talking about Udavala, where it's like they're able to adapt when you work in this way to perturbations or just changes in your environment, whether that be the environment in work or your environment, like, I don't know, in the external environment where your firm is operated, whether that be with customers or natural disasters or something like that. So yeah, I mean, again, go and read this whole thing because they go into talking about how this stuff really worked. I'm not going to go too into it. But again, you'll see how this is actually different from the viable system model. If you just took the viable system model and you just crudely slapped it onto your workplace, you would still have, like, managers in your work team, which you don't necessarily need. Like, you don't want there to be this differentiation on your individual work unit. Like, you want people to have all of the same technical understanding of the work process and be able to work together to kind of fill in where they need to and work in a cooperative way, as opposed to, like, an additional way, if that makes sense, like you get with production lines or whatever. You want it to be completely complementary, because that way you're able to actually be a variety adaptive system, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? So anyway, socio-technical studies needed to be carried out at 3 broad levels from micro to macro, all of which are interrelated. So this is kind of their kind of work method for understanding systems of work, basically, right? So they're the primary work systems. These are the systems which carry out the set of activities involved in an God, I'm a fucking idiot. Identifiable and bounded subsystem of a whole organization, such as a line department or a service unit. They may consist of a single face-to-face group or a number of such groups, together with support and specialist personnel and representatives of management, plus the relevant equipment and other resources. They have a recognized purpose which unifies the people and the activities. This is the thing that needs to be changed. Again, I sound like a broken clock, but your primary work systems need to have a redundancy of tasks, and everybody needs to be working in a cooperative way. Give everybody the training that they would need as if they're the only person in the fucking firm, and then go from there, okay? Don't just train people how to do one thing. That's like not variety. What is it? Variety increasing. It is variety increasing to train everybody to do everything. Okay, so you study the primary work system, then you look at the whole organizational systems. This is kind of what I would maybe use the viable system model for a little bit more, because I think that those 5 systems that you need to have a viable system model or whatever, to have a viable system, that's where they become, this is where they become the most useful, right? When you're looking at the whole organization, your whole firm. And then you got to look at macro social systems, right? And Beer is really, really good at this, where he basically says, you know, are you part of heavy industry? Okay, boom, there you go. You get slotted into heavy industry. But where does heavy industry intersect? Kind of, you get your input-output tables out, and you kind of go, okay, you know, how does this affect this? How is the consumer affected by the primary work systems and the whole organizational systems? Blah, 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 blah. And it's really simple. Just those 3 things. 3 simple steps. We like 3 simple steps here. And then again, this essay is kind of long, so you can go through it on your own time, because I'm not going to do it now. But yeah, it basically, you know, it goes into talking about how these things relate to like a couple of other... Ooh, do we want to talk about that? Norwegian Industrial Democracy Project. What notes do I have on this? None, actually, because it apparently wasn't that interesting. Anyway, go through it yourselves, but the main thing to note is redundancy of tasks and redundancy of training. Everybody needs to be able to know how to do everything more or less, and in so doing, you're actually going to feel like, how this relates to the car manufacturing stuff, it's like you're actually going to feel like you're someone that makes cars, as opposed to somebody that kind of just sits around and attaches rear view mirrors to parts of cars, you know what I mean? And then somebody tells you what to do, and you have to kind of completely change how everything works. Like, you want to be able to feel like you're doing something because you actually are, right? Like, you know how to make cars. That is a fundamental change to the way that you work. How would this work on a farm? You know how everything works. You know how to grow everything. You understand the soil ecology. People are not idiots. You can trust them with all of this knowledge, and they'll figure it out. Okay. So that's that. I'm going to put my fucking binder away. There's only one other thing I wanted to talk about. Is there anything on here? Oh, the only other thing that I wrote down about this stuff was that this is not indirect democracy like you see with... ooh, this is going to ruffle some feathers. This is not indirect democracy like you see with unions or councils or co-ops, right? This is literal direct democracy on the shop floor. It's the most direct of direct democracies that you can have because the worker actually understands what they're doing. I wonder if this stuff would naturally come if you just changed the right of disposal and got a socialist society. I think perhaps not. But again, if you just leave the socio-technical system shit to, like, I don't know, non-Marxists or whatever, like, or at least people who don't have an egalitarian outlook and people who don't understand, like, circuits of value accumulation, the way that capital actually functions, class as it actually exists along productive lines, they're just going to wind up trying to trust capitalists to implement this stuff because they'll be like, look, you like this, you like better productivity, why don't you make workers' lives better? Roger mentioned that at the Uddevalla plant, they literally had saunas for every work team, which, like, that's borderline fascist to me. But that's just because I don't like saunas. But again, like, you can't just trust this stuff to people who do not understand the way that class works and the social relations of capitalist society works. Because capitalists, even if you could convince them to treat the workers better, it's going to fall apart eventually like it did in Uddevalla. And there's an interesting thing to be said here about, like, actual power dynamics that you don't really necessarily get when you talk purely about, like, you know, capital and Marxism. You maybe read some Bookchin, maybe read some actual anarchists or some radical feminists to really understand the way that a lot of this stuff works. There is literally no reason for them to have as many managers at my job as they do, other than to just keep schmucks like me in line and to pay a certain segment of the working class enough so that it doesn't literally just fucking revolt. So that's another reason why we won't get this stuff until we actually get socialism. But again, the kind of flip side of that is that even if we get socialism, we might not get this stuff. Actual concrete organizing of workplaces in a better, less alienating way. 1 thumbs up from me, only because I'm holding the binder with my other hand. Okay, so if I get rid of that, and then I add this, what happens? Nothing. There it is. Hey, perfect. Okay, so this is one other thing I wanted to talk about. put my goddamn binder away. This is just the last thing. I went back and I reread this. This is, I believe, the last essay that Mike Davis wrote before he died, which is sad because Mike Davis fucking rocked. And I think maybe we just go through and read all of it because it's very short and we'll see if we agree with it or not. I'm not certain if I actually agree with a lot of it, but it is incredibly depressing and incredibly fascinating. So we'll see. We'll get through it all together. It's called Thanatos Triumph, and it was published on March 7th, 2022, in Sidecar, which is, I guess, just like the blog of the New Left Review. Maybe publish this one to the main website, New Left Review. Come on. I'm not denigrating Sidecar. I just have never heard of it. That's just because I'm an asshole. That's what are you going to do? Okay, so we'll start it out. It's basically, Thanatos is like the personification of death. So with that in mind, let's get into reading the essay. This has nothing to do with the sociotechnical system stuff, by the way. This is just something I kind of wanted to read. So he starts it off. Can I zoom in here? Will that make a difference? It's very tiny for everybody. Yeah, that's kind of better. It's also kind of weird. That one, that one. I like that one. I'll do that one, though. Does hegemony require grand design in a world where 1,000 gilded oligarchs, billionaire sheiks, and silicon deities rule the human future? We should not be surprised to discover that greed breeds reptilian minds. Mike Davis confirmed Reptilian Overlords guy. What I find most remarkable about these strange days as thermobaric bombs melt shopping malls and fires rage in nuclear reactors is the inability of our supermen to validate their power in any plausible narrative of the near future. That's so fucking brutal. So, okay, I'll keep reading and then we'll get into it. By all accounts, Putin, who surrounds himself... Is that Vladimir Putin? I believe it is. Who surrounds himself with as much astrology, mysticism, and perversion as the terminal Romanovs, that's not a situation you want to be in, sincerely believes that he must save the Ukrainians from being Ukrainians, lest the celestial destiny of the Rus becomes impossible. The present must be smashed in order to make an imaginary past the future. Fucking brutal. God, it's so brutal to imagine him reading this just like terminally ill, or writing this just terminally ill. Far from the arch strongman and master deceiver admired by Trump, Orban, and Bolsonaro, Putin is simply ruthless, impetuous, and prone to panic. The people in the streets of Kiev and Moscow who laughed away the threat until the missiles started falling were naive only in expecting that no rational leader would sacrifice the 21st century Russian economy to raise a faux double eagle over the Dnieper. Indeed, no rational leader would. But on the other shore, Biden conducts a non-stop seance with Dean Acheson and all the ghosts of the Cold Wars of Cold Wars past. The White House is visionless in the wilderness it helped to create. All the think tanks and genius minds that supposedly guide the Clinton-Obama wing of the Democratic Party are in their own way as lizard-brained as the soothsayers in the Kremlin. They can't imagine any intellectual framework for declining American power other than nuclear-tipped competition with Russia and China. One could almost hear the sigh of relief as Putin lifted the mental burden of having to think global strategy in the Anthropocene. In Anthropocene? Really? Really? Mike Davis? Come on, now you know better than that. In the end, Biden has turned out to be the same warmonger in power that we feared Hillary Clinton would be. Although Eastern Europe now distracts, who can doubt Biden's determination to seek confrontation with in the South China Sea, waters far more dangerous than the Black Sea? Excuse me. Meanwhile, the White House seems to have almost casually chucked its weak commitment to progressivism in the trash. A week after the most frightening report in history, one that implied the coming decimation of poor humanity, climate change rated nary a mention in the State of the Union. How could it compare to the transcendental urgency of rebuilding NATO? And Trayvon Martin and George Floyd are now just roadkill, rapidly vanishing from sight in the rearview mirror of the presidential limousine as Biden rushes around, reassuring cops that he's their best friend. That's absolutely fucking brutal. But this is not simply a betrayal. The US left bears its own share of responsibility for the dismal outcome. Almost none of the energies generated by Occupy, BLM, and the Sanders campaign were channeled into rethinking global issues and framing a renewed politics of solidarity. Equally, there has been no generational replenishment of the radical mind power I.F. Stone, Isaac Deutscher, William Appleman Williams, I don't know who that is, D.F. Fleming, John Gerassi, Gabriel Kolko, Noam Chomsky, to name just a few, that was once focused laser-like on foreign policy. Nor has the EU, for its part, conquered the problems of epochal characterization and the foundations of a new geopolitics. Having hitched its star to trade with China and natural gas from Russia, Germany in particular risks spectacular disorientation. The Milquetoast Coalition Berlin is ill-equipped, to say the least, to find an alternative path to prosperity. How's Alternative for Deutschland doing these days? One would hope badly, but I think actually kind of well, unfortunately. Likewise, Brussels, even if temporarily reanimated by the Russian peril, remains the capital of a failed superstate, a union that has been unable to collectively manage the migration crisis, the pandemic, or the strongmen in Budapest and Warsaw. An expanded NATO entrenched behind a new eastern wall is a cure worse than the disease. Brutal. Everyone is quoting Gramsci on the interregnum, but that assumes that something new will or could be born. I doubt it. I think what we must diagnose instead is a ruling class brain tumor, a growing inability to achieve any coherent understanding of global change as a basis for defining common interests and formulating large-scale strategies. So that's his kind of general thesis that he's getting to, right? That the ruling class of today is fundamentally ill-equipped to do anything about anything, right? Obviously, when we look at climate change, you look at fucking who shows up to the COP summits or to, you know, any of the big, supposedly big IPCC fucking panels. It's all fucking oil executives, right? You look at, like, the rising stochastic violence in places like the United States, whether that be targeted against, like, LGBTQ people, whether that be targeted against immigrants, as in Europe, it's just on the rise, right? And there's a fundamental inability to do anything about that, even though there is this police state that's, you know, bigger than anything the world has ever fucking seen before, right? There's an inability to coordinate internationally. There's an inability to coordinate domestically. Things, Mike Davis would say, are not going so well. So he says, in part, this is the victory of pathological presentism, making all calculations on the basis of short-term bottom lines in order to allow the super rich to consume all the good things of the earth within their lifetimes. Michael Aglietta, in his recent Capitalism, le temps de ruptures, emphasizes the unprecedented character of the new sacrificial generational divide. Greed has become radicalized to the extent that it no longer needs political thinkers and organic intellectuals, just Fox News and bandwidth. Brutal. In the worst case scenario, Elon Musk will simply lead a billionaire migration off the planet. Okay, well, that's not going to fucking happen, but I see your point. It also may be the case that our rulers are blind because they lack the penetrating eyesight of revolution, bourgeois or proletarian. A revolutionary era may dress itself in costumes of the past, as Marx articulates in the 18th Brumaire, but it defines itself by recognizing the possibilities for societal reorganization arising from new forces of technology and economics. In the absence of external revolutionary consciousness and the threat of insurrection, old orders do not produce their own counter-visionaries. That's really interesting. I wonder if that's actually true, right? Like when you look at times of stagnation, yeah, it almost feels circular, right? It's almost like there are times of stagnation, and so the people in like charge, quote unquote, of those times stagnate themselves. It's like, yeah, I suppose that makes sense. But I don't know. I'm kind of the mind that like the ruling class is much more afraid of the like quote unquote working class than we really recognize. I don't see how else you could kind of explain things like, you know, massive crackdowns on like I don't know, like anarchists who like tie themselves to trees, or like, I suppose, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement was like a large social movement that, you know, accomplished pretty incredible things. So I would probably also be afraid if I was in charge of that, right? But like, I don't know. There is certainly a fear, but I think that maybe what he's saying that is actually right is like, I was thinking about this a bit today, like, it has been a long time since a successful revolution, right? Successful revolution in air quotes, or at least one that toppled bourgeois power. And, you know, 50 years ago, the people who were veterans of the Cold War who were in charge of everything, like real veterans, you know what I mean? Like the old school people who were around after the like new kind of order in the post-war compact, right? Like they knew that at any time, if they let their guard down, there could be a Bolshevization of America, right? Or, you know, people who were old enough to remember when there were like actual communists who had sway in the Labour Party in England, right? Like people now don't really recognize that that's a possibility. And part of that, I think, has to do with like maybe the fact that like this idea of the working class needs to be rethought on our end as to like what it is that that actually means, and maybe thinking more about like working class communities as opposed to like individual working class agents. But like for their end, I think they just think that no revolution there. I don't know. I get the sense that the ruling class is fundamentally afraid of what the working class might do. But at the same time, they might also not think that there is a possibility for revolution. Like, there's a reason, though, I guess, that the American political establishment banded together to, like, make sure Bernie didn't get the nomination. A, like, milquetoast fucking wannabe social democrat who, like, even if he got power, would have just been gridlocked to complete oblivion, right? Like, they can't even have that, right? Because that would maybe upset the, like, war machine too much or something like that, right? So part of it is I don't think they're afraid of insurrection. I think they're just afraid of, like, maybe accumulation slowing down. But I'm not sure. I think, I don't know, some of that's got to give soon. Like, there's got to be something resembling an insurrection soon. Because as climate change gets worse and as the fucking economic situation gets worse, something's got to give. Let me note, however, the curious example of the speech that Thomas Piketty gave on 16th of February at the Pentagon's National Defense University. As part of a regular series of talks on responding to China, the French economist argued that the West must challenge Beijing's rising hegemony by abandoning its dated hyper-capitalist model and promoting instead a new emancipatory egalitarian horizon on a global scale. That's fucking not going to happen, Thomas, but thank you very much. A strange venue and pretext, to say the least, for advocating democratic socialism, indeed. Nature, meanwhile, is taking back the reins over history, making its own titanic compensations at the expense of powers, especially over natural and engineered infrastructures that empires once thought to control. In this light, here we go, he corrects himself. In this light, the Anthropocene, with its hint of the Promethean, seems especially ill-fitted to the reality of apocalyptic capitalism. Indeed it does. Capitalocene, baby. As an objection to my pessimism, one might claim that China is clear-sighted and that everyone else is blind. Certainly, its vast vision of a unified Eurasia, the Belt and Road Project, is a grand design for the future, unequaled since the sun of the American century rose over a war-shattered world. But China's genius, 1949 to 1959 and 1979 to 2013, okay, has been its neo-Mandarin practice of collective leadership, centralized but plurivocal. Xi Jinping, in his ascent to Mao's throne, is the worm in the apple. Although he has shut the fuck up. Although he has economically and militarily enhanced China's clout, his reckless unleashing of ultranationalism could yet open a nuclear Pandora's box. Oh, fucking hell. We are living through the nightmare edition of Great Men Make History. Unlike the High Cold War, when politburos, parliaments, presidential cabinets, and general staffs to some extent countervailed the megalomania at the top, there are few safety switches between today's maximum leaders and Armageddon. Never has so much fused economic, mediatic, and military power been put into so few hands. It should make us pay homage to the hero graves of Alexander Ilyich Ulyanov, Alexander Berkman, and the incomparable Sholem Schwarzbard. Pretty brutal. So that was the last thing that, like, my first communist hero fucking wrote. And it doesn't seem so good. Side note, if you don't know who Sholem Schwarzbard is, look him up. One of the coolest people that has ever lived. Incredibly cool human being. So that was Thanatos Triumph. I mean, I guess, like, what do we think about that? Like, is this on one hand just like grumpy old man saying grumpy old man things, the world's ending, as grumpy old communists tend to do and have done in perpetuity since communists were a thing? Or is he actually right? Well, I think he's right about a couple of things. I think he's definitely right that there's an inability to coordinate, a growing inability to coordinate amongst the capitalist class, partially due to just our material circumstances of things kind of falling apart, but I don't know, just partially due to, like, there are just fundamental differences in the ruling class, and there always have been, right? In the capitalist class. Like, it's never been one coherent entity that always wants one thing beyond the continued accumulation of capital. But I mean, even that, like, further accumulation of capital in one sector might mean less accumulation in another, right? Like real estate versus agricultural industries, right? So there's a growing inability. Everybody wants what they can't have, especially with the threat of climate change. You're beginning to see like real estate industries in the southwest of America being told by the government, like, actually, you kind of have to stop developing because we just literally don't have the water for it. This is happening in Phoenix at the moment because they kind of got the shit end of the stick, unsurprisingly, in the kind of ongoing Colorado River, who's going to get what amount of water talks that have been going on that the federal government is now overseeing. You're also seeing the federal government stepping in and being like, in California, like, hey, you guys need to stop using so much water. Wells are running dry. You know, huge amounts of agricultural land are going fallow, specifically things like the fucking nut orchards in the Central California Valley. And so, yeah, like I think that maybe that pretends, like a Bonapartist candidate could kind of come along. I know that this is something that a couple of people have put forward as a distinct possibility. Someone who's able to like supposedly like, well, what is it the Bonapartist candidates do, right? Like they break these contradictions of a capitalist society in such a way that they're able to be a populist candidate who does short-term solutions, right? Like a Bonapartist candidate, say governor of, no, let's just say like mayor of Phoenix or governor of Arizona or something like that, would come in and be like, fuck you, federal government, we're going to develop as much as we want, because they just get a ton of money donated to them by like Phoenix asshole, like real estate developers, right? And they get themselves elected through some disgusting ideology, which is in the milieu now of the Republican Party of like anti-trans, anti-immigrant bullshit, which we've seen all before. And so maybe that happens. But the thing that's interesting about that is that like you can't break the contradictions of climate change. Like you just can't if you're a capitalist, right? Or a politician. Like you can, you know, when the fascists came into power in Italy or in Germany, they were able to like smash the contradictions of like a hugely frustrated workers movement and a capitalist class that was like heavily monopolized at the expense of the working class, obviously, getting that back together through just like sheer physical intimidation and brutality. And also while using like the petty bourgeoisie as like a stepping stone, even though this was all in favor of like monopoly capital, right? So you're able to like, if you're a fascist or a Bonapartist or something like that, like you're able to break those social contradictions in a way that you're able to like keep accumulation going for just a little bit longer. But you can't do that with climate. So like maybe I do see what he's saying, where it's just like something's got to give, and it might just be unmitigated fucking violence. Like we'll see. I think unless something gives in the communist direction, in a workers' movement direction, I think he is I think he is right about this being a moment in time that is going to decide the continued existence of a large part of poor humanity. You just look every day at the temperatures in somewhere like Southeast Asia, or droughts across kind of like the North African continent, or in Central and South America, pushing migration, in that case, to kind of like North America, Mexico, the United States, Canada, things like that. Like, yeah, I don't know. It's not looking so good. Things are not looking so good. So I do understand what he's saying here. The thing that's interesting to me about it, though, is like we're living through the kind of like gnarly phase of a great man theory of history, right? Where he's like, I've heard him talk before about like, I think in the next 20 years, he said there's just going to be like a small scale nuclear exchange, because how could there not be? In a place like, you know, Pakistan and India, where these like, you know, the national bourgeoisie do have like interests that are not aligned to such an extent where they might be willing to exchange nuclear armaments, shall we say. That could maybe happen. I don't know, though. I do think that the bourgeoisie is smart enough to not just go like full, you know, nuclear exchange, just because if we die, they die too, right? So like in the context of a massive workers movement that pushes them out of power, I don't necessarily see them just like firing the fucking nukes. I also don't really see that happening for some inter-bourgeois struggle, right? Like some inter-capitalist class conflict struggle. Maybe a regional nuclear exchange could happen, but I don't fucking know, man. This stuff's all so brutal. But yeah, good times. Thanatos Triumphant. Let me know what you think. I'll be willing to talk about this stuff more in the comments. For now, I gotta open a fucking window because it's fucking hot in there. Sorry to leave you all on such a sad note. Let me... Yeah, we'll end it by just looking at Ralph. Look at him. He's looking real good there. So thanks, everybody, for joining. Like I said, feel free to continue talking about this stuff in the comments. I'll be keeping an eye on that. And until next time, let's hope Mike Davis is wrong.